All right, what's up, fam? It's Broke Capitalist coming at you, and I got two beautiful people with me today to go. We're going to look at this video, and we're going to talk about what we see and see where it goes. All right? So here we go. It's what I'm calling now Happy Thomas Sowell Tuesday instead of Friday. So this is coming at you on a Tuesday. So happy Thomas Sowell Tuesday. Here we go.
While slavery existed in the American colonies through the establishment of the United States as a country until the end of the Civil War, there have been many misconceptions about slavery in general. Most Americans are not aware that there were some Black former slaves and freemen who also owned Black slaves. And some became very prominent in politics as well, despite the racial prejudice that existed. Some Black slave owners inherited their slaves from their masters, who were themselves freed in their wills. Others were either born free or emancipated by their masters and then bought their own slaves, while others were able to buy their own freedom and that of their families. Who were these Black slave owners, and how did they attain such a status in a white-dominated society? What set them apart from other Blacks, and what made them comparable to whites in some of the colonies and later states? What changed in colonial society, altering the status of indentured servants to lifetime slaves, and why? Who was Anthony Johnson?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former soldier, Marine Corps scout sniper, history professor, historian, and book author. And we will answer these questions and other issues on this segment of Forgotten History.
You guys know how it is when you buy a new Mac.
Should have did it, Barry. Should have did it.
Pretty soon after, it starts to slow down. That's probably
The vast majority of African Americans in the United States were enslaved, in all of the states, not just the South. Our first person of note is Anthony Johnson, who was born in Angola and captured by Portuguese slave traders, and he was given the name Antonio. Then his captors sold him into the Atlantic slave trade. He sailed to Virginia in 1621 aboard the ship James. The Virginia muster, or census, of 1624 lists his name as Antonio, not given, and he was recorded as a Negro in the notes column and indentured. Antonio, later Anthony, was bought by a colonist in Virginia, but treated as an indentured servant, which was not unusual. And Antonio worked for a merchant at the Virginia Company, and he became a Catholic. Johnson was sold as an indentured servant to a white planter named Bennett to work on his Virginia tobacco farm. Technically, he was not a slave because the slave laws were not passed until 1661 in Virginia. So prior to that date, Africans were not officially considered to be slaves in that colony. According to the records kept by his benefactor and the existing documents, Anthony was nearly killed in the Indian Massacre of 1622 when the Powhatan Indians attacked colonists in the Tidewater region of Virginia. On Good Friday, they raided the settlement, including the Bennett farm where Antonio worked, and killed 52 of the 57 men present. Antonio apparently fought back and was wounded and earned the esteem of his master. In 1623, a Black woman named Mary arrived aboard the ship Margaret and John. She was brought to work on the same plantation as Antonio, where she was the only woman present. Antonio and Mary married and lived together for more than 40 years. Around 1635, Antonio and Mary completed their indentured servitude, and Antonio changed his name to Anthony Johnson. He first entered the legal record as an unindentured free man when he purchased a calf in 1647. During this early period, free Blacks enjoyed relative equality with whites, and about 20% of the free Blacks in Virginia owned their own homes and property.
So is anything new so far?
What you mean by new?
New to you?
Yeah, pretty much the whole story.
Okay. Anybody ever heard of Anthony Johnson?
I never heard.
Oh,
Right,
and honestly, until this, I never really heard of the actual individuals who owned slaves who were also Black. So this is interesting.
Oh, okay. All right. So this is, I know when I was in school, when they start throwing out these like years, it kind of like zips past me, but it's really important, right?
Mhm.
So he got here apparently in 21, I think, or 24. So that's almost 400 years ago, right? And that's basically well over 100 years before America became a country. So we became a country in 1776. This is in 1621. So almost 125 years before what we now know as America came about. So, and what's really important here too is that he was not technically a slave, because before then, legally, everyone was an indentured servant. I know when I was growing up, I was told that the blacks were the slaves and the whites were the indentured servants. But it's really important to emphasize the time frame in which you're talking, right? So yes, of course, in 10 years before the Civil War, all the blacks were slaves. But 100 years before America became a country, or 120 odd years in this time period, you didn't even have technically slaves, right? As we know the term to mean. Slave for life. Like you were born a slave, you died a slave. That didn't exist at this point in time. Right.
1662, the Virginia colony passed a law that children in the colony were born with the social status of their mother. This meant that the children of slave women were born into slavery, even if their fathers were free, European, Christian, and white. This was a reversal of English common law, which held that the children of English subjects took the status of their father. The Virginia colonial government expressed the opinion that since Africans were not Christians, common law could not and did not apply to them, even if they converted, as Anthony Johnson did. On July 24, 1651, Johnson acquired 250 acres of land under the existing headright system when he bought the contracts of 5 indentured servants, one being his son, Richard Johnson. Under the headright system, if a man were to bring indentured servants over to the colonies, and in this particular case, Johnson brought 5 servants, he was owed 50 acres a head for servant. The land in question.
So you guys get that?
Yeah.
So you had this brother from Angola who was captured by the Portuguese. No, the brother from Angola was captured by other Africans, sold to Portuguese, put on a ship, got sold again to somebody in Virginia. Then he became an indentured servant there, got his freedom. So around 1651, he got 250 acres of land and got his own indentured servants to work the land, right? All right.
Was located on the Great Nisswauk Creek, which flowed into the Punkateague River in Northampton County, Virginia. This was where Anthony Johnson operated his successful tobacco farm, and one of his indentured servants was John Cassord, who became one of the first men to be declared indentured for life, effectively a slave. Under the 1645 Virginia Taxation Act, all Negro men and women and all other men from the age of 16 to 60 shall be judged tithable. So after a fire in 1652 caused him great financial damage to his property, he applied for relief in the courts and won. Back then, people were taxed, not property, but indentured servants and later slaves were taxed as property. It is unclear from the records why the Johnson women were exempted, but the change gave them the same social standing as white women who were not taxed. In the colonies back then, one was judged more on their religion as opposed to race or ethnicity in general. So until the advent of actual legal slavery, upward mobility was possible for many races.
Okay. So, I'm a little older, but when I was in school, it was all about race. You were a slave because you were black, blah, blah, blah. But back in the day, literally, it was less about race and more about your religion. And although this is a brief period in time, but it actually happened, right? So this dude, when they said tithable, I believe that means taxable. So this dude was able to basically gained the status of everyone else. And this is 100 and some odd years before America even became what we know as America, Sorry. Any questions, concerns, insights?
Not really. It's just very interesting. It's something new. Yeah, I'm just kind of
All right.
like, whoa, blown back.
All right, we'll go with it.
During the case, the justices noted that Anthony and Mary Johnson had lived in Virginia for over 30 years and were highly respected in their community. In fact, a 1653 Northampton County Court document lists Mary as Anthony's wife. By the 1650s, Anthony and Mary Johnson were farming 250 acres in Northampton County, while their two sons owned 550 acres. They also had additional indentured persons under contract, but the exact numbers are not known. His son, Richard Johnson, also had his own indentured persons, probably given to him by his father, who were effectively slaves with a shelf life. At some point, if contracted, they would have to be set free. In 1854, John Cassor, who had been sentenced to indentured service for life for his escaping a previous owner in 1640, filed a suit against Johnson.
Okay, that's important. So way back, like the slavery we've been taught basically is you're born a slave. To no fault of your own, you're just, boom, you're a slave. But throughout human history, you can, through your own actions, become a slave, right? That's through war and through crime. So this guy, John Caesar, committed a crime, and he was deemed, and he still wasn't deemed a slave. He was deemed an indentured servant for the rest of his life, right? But he still wasn't given the status of slave. You just got to work for somebody else for the rest of your life, right? Okay.
Claiming his indentured service had expired, and he went to work for Robert and George Parker,
Let me
service for life for his escaping a previous owner in 1640, filed a suit against Johnson, claiming his indentured service had expired, and he went to work for Robert and George Parker. Johnson filed a freedom suit to get Cassor back, but Parker won. What is amazing in retrospect was that Johnson, a black man, was not only able to file a petition to the court, but he was able to testify and give evidence in the court, which illustrates the rather egalitarian system in place at that time. However, Johnson appealed to the County Court of Northampton County, Virginia, and the court reversed its ruling and sent Cassor back to Johnson in 1855, and Parker was forced to pay Johnson compensation.
That may have been a little hard to follow, but did you follow it? So for those who didn't, who may watch this, so you got a black guy who works for another black guy's indentured servant. That guy, Caesar, said, hey man, my contract is up with you. It's been up for about 7 years. And this white guy over across the road, for whatever reason, I like him better than you. So I'm gonna go and work for him. So the black guy, Anthony Johnson, was like, nah, home, you still owe me. And Caesar was like, no, I don't. I'm going to Richard. And what happens is Anthony Johnson ends up suing Richard, the white guy, right? You took this is my indentured servant, you can't have him. Court, they go to court. Anthony Johnson testifies. So it's basically Anthony Johnson versus this white guy named, I think his last name was Richards or something like that, and John Caesar. Anthony Johnson won the case. So John had to go back to Anthony Johnson, and Richard had to pay Anthony Johnson damages.
Wow.
Right? Okay. So we're all caught up.
Then Cassor made history, as he was probably the first person who was declared slave for life in Virginia. That means that his black owner, Anthony Johnson, was probably the very first slave owner in all of the colonies, himself a black man. There were both black and white indentured servants, the whites being the most Irish of all, who, like the blacks, were also sentenced to lifetime servitude before Cassor's case. The difference was that the whites could eventually purchase their freedom in most cases. Therefore, Anthony Johnson was apparently not only the first African American whose right to own a slave for life was recognized in the colonies, he was therefore technically the first actual legal slave owner, regardless of being black or white, as established by the Virginia court. Soon afterwards, slavery was legal in all of the colonies. Later, Johnson moved his family to Somerset County, Maryland, and leased 300 acres for tobacco farming for 99 years, which he called Torrey's Vineyards. When Anthony Johnson died in 1670, that August, his plantation was given to Robert Parker, not to Johnson's children. The justification delivered by an all-right jury.
Robert Parker, I'm sorry, I said Richard. Robert Parker is the guy who Anthony Johnson sued, right? And then after Anthony Johnson sued him, I'm getting ahead of this guy, but him and his family lost all their property. And Robert, the other guy who he sued, ended up getting his property in the end.
Wow.
Ruled that Anthony's land in Virginia that was given to his sons could be seized because he was a Negro and by consequence an alien. As a result, the 50 acres that Anthony had given to his son Richard wound up in the hands of his wealthy white neighbor George Parker. It didn't matter that Richard, a free man, had lived on the land with his wife and children for 5 years. A judge then had ruled that Anthony Johnson, as he was not a citizen of the colony because he was black, but he did own his own slaves, could maintain his property. What soon arrived after Johnson's death was a system of legal slavery in which enslavement was lifelong, hereditary, and based solely on race, and effectively established in all of the colonies in the beginning of the 18th century. As a result, Johnson has been referred to historically as the Black Patriarch of the first community of Negro property owners in America. He was the first Black slave owner to be involved in a court case that resulted in an indentured Black man, John Castor, to be legally determined as a slave for life. In effect, because hereditary slavery was not in effect during his period of ownership of Castor, the slave for life and others he purchased, it is arguable that Anthony Johnson was in fact the first actual slave owner in the American colonies, and he was a Black man. We hope you.
Now, I've researched this myself, so everything this guy is telling you is true. I ain't gonna say I got the actual documents, but Anthony Johnson, you could look him up on Wikipedia and all this stuff. There's other stuff that they left out about him, saying that he was awarded property because he was such a great citizen by the county. So I think the purpose of this, what I wanted to show was how monolithic, meaning there's just one voice about slavery in America, like bad, like slavery bad. That's it. Like you can't go any further than that, right? So this story alone brings up so much stuff, right? You have Black property owners. You have Black property owners who weren't considered citizens. At one point, he was such a great citizen that the county gave him property, right? Besides the head right thing, he was such a great citizen that, okay, here you go. You got, as a citizen, we're going to grant you this property. Then later, they're like, nah, because you're Black, you're not a citizen, and we going to give your property to the guy you sued to create the first slave in America. Like, this story is nuts. But the main thing about this story is no one's ever heard of Anthony Johnson.
Yeah, I haven't. Never heard of him.
I mean, when you think about the story of slavery, wouldn't you think like this is important or at least worth mentioning?
I agree. I think so.
Or is it not worth mentioning?
I feel like when we talk about slavery, like it's like, okay, like this information is needed, but it's one of those things that's kind of like underlining. It's kind of like the people who want to get the last word type thing, like, okay, yeah, we went through slavery, but you guys were the first ones type of thing. Like, of course you guys did the research to find this man. Like y'all went above and beyond to find Anthony Johnson. We don't even know that. We still trying to figure out our own ancestral roots. And of course, they went beyond to find it. And I'm pretty sure it's true, but I'm also comparing it to like the storyline in A Woman is King is also has different pieces that kind of go into the whole, Black people being part of the slave trade, Black people, owning slaves. And I feel like there's a conversation to be had, and there's no beautiful, we're not trying to put a love story to it at all because
Right.
it's Black folks. But you're right, we do need to have more conversation. We do need to know Anthony Johnson, but also too, we're very critical right now at a time where we know many of our history has been, played with, lied, altered, all sorts of stuff. For us, we have to be careful with the background information that we look up and how we do our extra research.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, I have the best video on Anthony Johnson that's short and concise is by this guy. And I don't know who he is, but the information is accurate. I do know like African American scholars who've written on this subject, Thomas Sowell being one, I believe Walter Williams being another one. I've done the research myself. So the truth, in my opinion, the truth is the truth. And like you said, with that recent movie that I unfortunately didn't see, but I heard the controversy surrounding it. That's we can go all day and night about like what's important or how weighted stuff should be. But the purpose of this was to just get your reactions on truthful information that I think is important, but no one talks about. Here's a great example. Black History Month. Do you think this will ever be mentioned during Black History Month?
I don't think so.
And if not, like, why wouldn't it? Like, if Black history is about Black people, this is not a getcha moment or I got you. Now it's just a legitimate question. Like, if you can, on this land, identify the court, not just the court case, but the defendants and the plaintiffs that led to the first human being to be legally recognized as a slave. Now, like I said, you had indentured servants, but that's like a contract, right? That will expire at some point. And then if you steal from somebody, or if you break your contract as an indentured servant, you could be sentenced to being an indentured servant for life. But the status of you're a slave for life, that started with this case, just happened to be, Anthony Johnson and John Caesar, right? So I would think if we're going to have a Black history, that's where you start. That's where at least that's one of the places you would start.
I would think that would be a good place to start for like Black American history. So I mean, like we heard of our olden times too, from like, from the roots of Africa and other places as well. Like I think that should also be mentioned in our Black history as well.
Yeah, I mean, we started in Africa, so it should go back to Africa. But it looks like I'm gonna have to either upgrade or log off. So I hope y'all got something out of this. Hey, Phoenix, thanks so much for sharing and being here
Thank you
with
for
us.
having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we'll do it again. But I'm gonna sign off. Thank you guys. Peace.
Sorry, guys. All right.
Okay. Talk to you guys later.
All right, peace.
I just wanted to remind you guys to check out thebrokecapitalist.com. You'll find some awesome books there, including a historical fantasy fiction series that I star in, called Ideas in Blood.